I think the biggest mistake of my career was the fact that I used to work 24/7. I would take work home with me. I was constantly checking emails, and what I learned from that is you can be much more creative, much more innovative, and much more fresh if you just take a moment to unplug from the day-to-day, take a breath, and realize that it's not always about work, and sometimes your work gets better if you unplug.
Okay, so my biggest mistake early on in my career has been to just you can't assume that everybody's using their brain, so to not articulate everything.
Biggest mistake I ever made was a huge party in '97, big tent, January, weather had dropped. We brought in extra propane heaters, but I left the clothes up to some other staff instead of me, and the last guy out turned the generator off because he thought he should, so everything in the tent froze, including thousands of dollars worth of flowers and plants that needed to be used for 2 more days worth of events. So I learned a lot from that, but we were able to really repair it and fix it the next morning, and no one really knew.
You know, I think that, let's just say that I now understand the importance of having backup generators for power at an event.
Biggest mistake in business has been to expand in territories that are not familiar to us for the sake of expanding without knowledge, without the right partnership and knowledge, and we've learned from it. Although we keep expanding now, we make sure we have the right partner and understand the marketplace before we do so.
Biggest mistake was giving a third of my business away. What did I learn? Never do it again.
Biggest mistake for me was trying to do too much too fast. Being a designer and a producer and running a furniture business at the same time became overwhelming to try to be somebody to everybody. So what I felt that is to finally pull a group of people together that have worked for the company for all these years that can help me pace everything out. So if as a project comes along, we're not going to overkill ourselves with too much work in short little time and stripping everybody of their possibilities.
My biggest mistake has been underestimating the wow factor. So what I learned is that people really will pay a lot of money and be much more interested in spaces that are enormously creative than your typical space.
We were catering this huge wedding in Santa Barbara, and it was pretty early on, and our truck broke down on the 101 driving up to Santa Barbara that afternoon. So it was pretty much of a fiasco. We actually ended up having to have the staff come back and load all their cars up with the food. You know, we ended up getting there an hour and a half late, and we pulled it off, but it was rough, and it was not something I would like to ever have to do again.
I think the biggest mistake in my professional career was accepting an opportunity for the wrong reasons. So I think what I learned there is to really be specific about what I want and what I'm looking for in my professional career. So I learned to take my time and do the work, do the homework, and really make sure that the fit is right for what I'm looking to do.
I think my biggest mistake was when I first started working in this field and working with so many people, and you would sit around in rooms and go over what everything was, and that I sometimes wouldn't ask the questions, or I'd be prepared, and I notice a lot of people are prepared to gloss over details that may come back to haunt you later. And now I guess I'm much more willing to explore all of that and to try and drill down to what's going to happen.
One of my biggest mistakes has been to listen too much to a client, where I was in a situation where a client told me they wanted something specific, but it really wasn't right for their brand, and I spent a lot of time interpreting their concept, and then their boss came in and was really upset with what the outcome was. And I learned that it's important as a lighting designer or as a professional in this business to interpret what people want, because they're really relying on your knowledge of what you do in order to bring their point across.
My biggest mistake has been underestimating the scope of a project on all levels. When I first started out, you know, from budget to staffing to resources, and I've learned since to really never underestimate the scope of a project, no matter how small it seems when you first get the brief.
For me, it would be not to delegate. it took me a long time to learn that process.
I think it's getting it in writing and learn is a contract. Recently, actually, worked on some projects where I've put some faith and trust, and you know, it comes back sometimes, and you really need to get everything in writing. Put the contracts down. As much as this is a fun, exciting, celebratory event, it still needs to go to a contract. So I think that's probably the biggest thing that I've learned in the operations side. On the other side, let's say from a design standpoint, is that less isn't more. More is more. You can never have enough, I believe, whether it's floral, whether it's design, whether it's lighting. I always feel like when I'm walking through that, if there's not enough of something, I see it right away. So less is not more, more is more.
The biggest mistake, I feel, it was allowing a client to talk me into a bad idea. There was a dinner that we did about 5 years ago, and in this particular case, the client wanted to do a dinner of small plates, a series of small plates, which is very chic, and she was from Europe, and it made a lot of sense for her friends there. It didn't fly in Washington. There were a lot of complaints about the style and the content, and I had gone into this knowing that it probably wasn't a good idea.
My biggest mistake that I've made is not being very straightforward with the client when their budget is unrealistic for what they want to do. And I've learned since then to really say, I hear what you want to do, but here's what your budget's going to buy you. And just show them what they're going to get for their money, not what they're not going to get.
Well, I try not to make too many mistakes, but you have to make some along the way. And I think just getting into too many other businesses, I tried getting more into the restaurant world, where I'm really more of an event specialist and a venue specialist. And, you know, I definitely took a little bit of my lumps there, you know. But creatively, it was great.
The biggest mistake, and I did it more than one time, was giving the client exactly what they verbalize, what they say that they want. And that can get you into a lot of trouble. They're coming to people like myself for my expertise. And I know a whole lot more about parties and more about event design than they do. So I think it's good advice to everybody in the industry is listen to them, but then edit it and make it your own.
The biggest mistake I found I can make is when I get scared and I don't take the extra step it takes. So in design, if one of my designers wants to take something a little further and I'm a little nervous about it, if we do it, if we go for it, as long as we can execute it perfectly, then we do it. Because the outcome that we've come up with by taking that extra step is amazing. It's over the top, and it takes you to the next level versus just staying ordinary.
Many years ago, I did a project. It was a holiday party for AIG, and it was at 55 Wall Street, when it was 55 Wall Street and not a Cipriani space. And we made all of these garlands for the balconies. And in the studio, they all looked really huge. And then we got into this space with 75-foot ceilings, and they looked minuscule. And so I really focus a lot about the scale of the things that we make. And I always think about that day 14 years ago where I looked around and thought it was pretty underwhelming what we created. And now my staff laughs at me all the time because I always want everything bigger. No matter how big it is, I want it to be bigger.
I think the biggest mistake that I've made in my event career has been taking a client for granted. Basically, a client that I've had for a long time, slowly pushing them off onto someone else in the studio where I should have really been always taking care of them.
You know, when you're feeling pressured from other sources, be it the client, be it the venue, be it a technical person that's working for you, and they go, no, maybe it will work this way better, and then you cave, and I learned no more caving. There's compromising, but there's no 360 from the original direction that I started in.
I once got a call from a potential client who seemed to be a nutcase at first glance, and I was like, oh, forget about it. It's going to be a waste of time. And that person turned out to be one of my best clients still today. So I would say that my mistake was to underestimate the potential of that person.
I think the biggest mistake we've ever made, we learned earlier in our careers, is laying carpet over carpet. You have to really be sure that you do it right and make sure that the vendors that you hire know what they're doing.
And the key to hiring vendors is always double checking and triple checking that your schedule and their schedule, in fact, do marry up.
My biggest mistake has been speaking before budgets. I think that so many times you meet with a client and through the whole creative process, you just kind of talk about the whole look and feel without having a budget in mind. And I think that without knowing the actual execution or how you're going to produce that event, you can mislead them because they may not necessarily have the funds to create what you're suggesting.
So I think my biggest mistake was not being able to say no, and also feeling like I wasn't being compensated for the amount of work, time, and energy and effort that I put into my events. So I had to learn to say no, and it's in my business model. You know, we are not all things to all people. We have a certain clientele, and I like working with that clientele, and it's okay to say no.
Biggest mistake was we had a client that wants to save money, and on an event on the sound system, and we ended up going with another company for sound, and we had Tom Wolfe speaking, and the sound went bad for about 30 seconds, and it was the longest 30 seconds of my life. So I learned never ever to cut corners again.
But being a creative person, I'm not really looking at a bottom line. I think that was my biggest mistake. I have run a couple of businesses in my life, and I learned about how to read P&L.
Oh, my biggest mistake. It's a funny story. When I first started in this career, in this business, I built a 20-foot balloon sculpture and then surrounded the room with metallic shimmer drape. I learned very quickly that static clean is not really friendly to balloons, and the entire sculpture exploded in a sea of rubber confetti in the middle of the event.
I think one of the biggest mistakes as a designer is becoming overzealous. And what I mean by that is, I believe, there's an audience for fearlessness, meaning that, that to be creatively successful, you have to push the boundaries sometimes. That's how I measure my own success, is doing something I've never done before, but safety comes first. And what happened is I created something that was layered and layered and layered vertically, and it was in an exterior space, and it all crumbled when a rogue wind came across the property.
My biggest mistake is probably not paying more attention to the whole pastry side of cooking, because it's very precise and it's very scientific, so I kind of pay attention to it, but I really love that whole pastry side, so I'm learning about it now.
I think very early in my career, the mistake that I felt was the best learning experience for me was I was focusing on my portion of the event that was to take place. And I suddenly realized that once I got there, I did my portion, but I wasn't as attuned to the other people's things, and it didn't go well in my mind. So from then on, I always felt that it was most important to be very involved with the total picture so that it all plays together, because I could easily change mine to make it adaptable to someone else. And that was probably the best lesson to learn, and that is to just really look at the whole picture. Don't just look at your section.